Welcome to the program. I'm Jeff Schechtman. Billionaires, they're everywhere. In our headlines, our political debates, even our social media feeds. We talk about taxing them, about their philanthropy, about politics, and about the power they amass. We discuss billionaires incessantly, almost to the point of exhaustion. But how did this obsession begin? In many ways, Bill Gates is patient zero in our collective fixation on billionaires, particularly those bred in the tech world. Before there was Bezos and Musk and Zuckerberg or Thiel, there was Bill Gates. If Warren Buffett is the modern father figure of billionaires, Gates is undoubtedly the first son. Tech visionary, ruthless capitalist, global philanthropist, Gates has worn many hats. He's a man who has shaped our world in ways both obvious and subtle. But who is Bill Gates really? What drives him? And what does our fascination with him say about us? Bill Gates' story is a roller coaster of public perception. Once sued by the government as a monopolist, he later reinvented himself through philanthropy as the good billionaire. But recent years have brought divorce, scandal, connections to Jeffrey Epstein, all against a backdrop of growing public distaste for extreme wealth. How Gates is viewed has shifted dramatically, mirroring our changing relationship with billionaires as a whole. Moreover, Gates set the stage for much of the tech business landscape we see today. The corporate success of Microsoft, his many correct decisions in taking the company public, all laid the groundwork for other companies and venture capitalists that followed. His playbook became the template for an entire industry. To unpack this complex figure and what he represents in our culture, we're joined today by my guest, Anupreeta Das. She is the South Asia correspondent for the New York Times and the author of the new book, Billionaire Nerd Savior King, Bill Gates and His Quest to Shape the World. Anupreeta has spent years covering the intersection of wealth, power, and influence, and her book offers a penetrating look at Gates and the world he both shaped and was shaped by. It is my pleasure to welcome Anupreeta Das here to the program. Anupreeta, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me on. It's awesome to be here.
Well, it is a delight to have you here. What got you started on this? In writing about Bill Gates, he's been written about before. Billionaires, certainly we're drowning in. But the intersection of Bill Gates, philanthropy, billionaires, talk a little bit about how this thinking and how this book evolved in your own consciousness.
Yeah, my introduction or my process into this book was actually tangential. It tied into how his wealth was invested. When I was at the Wall Street Journal in 2014, I was covering Warren Buffett and Berkshire Hathaway, and I learned about Bill Gates's money manager and the fact that he had this massive investment firm called Cascade, and it was investing his money in everything from farmland to the Four Seasons hotel to stocks and bonds. And so it was interesting to me to see that that a billionaire is essentially like a Wall Street firm, right? If you're managing 100 billion plus of someone's fortune. So we wrote a story about that. And then when the divorce of Bill and Melinda French Gates happened in 2021, I was at the Times by then, running our finance coverage. But I got pulled into the reporting of the fortune and what happened to it after the divorce. And that led me to thinking about who Gates was, because in that time frame, a 2-year time frame from 2019 to 2021, you first heard about the Epstein connections, and then you had the news of the divorce, and there was news of his personal conduct, extramarital affairs. So that got me thinking about who this man was, because in my own mind, here was the Microsoft co-founder, here was a friend of Warren Buffett. Here was a big philanthropist who ran this massive foundation. Here was one of the founders of the Giving Pledge. At the same time, there were all of these shades of gray behind that persona. So I became very intrigued by that. And so that was my point of entry into writing this book. But I didn't want to do a strict biography. So then I built this sort of more interesting way to look at how his evolving image offers us ways to engage with broader themes that we're fixated on in society.
And one of those themes is really the way we look at billionaires. And for a while, Bill Gates had a lot of good publicity going on, a lot of good PR as this good billionaire. Talk about that.
It's interesting because when he was at Microsoft, as a co-founder, he was known for obviously his brilliance and for what Microsoft was in the national imagination, in the global imagination. And as a billionaire, he was seen as this manifestation of everything amazing, of the American dream at its apex. But then when he became a philanthropist full time, it was partly driven by the fact that there was very little that he could do at Microsoft, in the sense that he had become a distraction in the aftermath of the antitrust trial in the late 1990s. And so he turned around to see what else he could do, and he realized that philanthropy was a natural place for him to go. And even though I don't think, based on my reporting, that he turned to it purely to rehabilitate his image, it became such a big part of who he was, and that I think there was an opportunistic moment, right then to begin to uh, change the way he was viewed in the media to the world, to pitch a different side of Gates. And I think that's when you began to see this incredible change that's now more than 25 years old, his transformation into the good billionaire, someone who is selflessly putting his money to work. And there's a lot of good that the Gates Foundation has done. I mean, I don't want to discount that. But at the same time, the transformation, the brand building, the influence, being celebrated as a head of state wherever he goes, I think that transformation was incredible to document for me.
The other part of that was not just the philanthropy and deciding to go into philanthropy, but the decision to do it with respect to global health.
That's very much true. And I think the roots of that go back to, and he and Melinda have both talked about this. It's very much part of their origin story for the foundation, taking a trip to somewhere in Africa and seeing the destitution and the poverty. And I think for a lot of people, seeing that level of poverty is very, very hard to take. But he realized that his dollars actually had a purpose, could be used to improve what he saw was, obviously government failures, the ability for him to actually deliver health vaccines, put his money into work. So that became kind of the root and the central focus of the Gates Foundation. And Gates, again, being very science and tech driven and very rational, is very data driven. And so I think public health, because it had very, very measurable goals. So, you can have under 5 mortality rates, you can have these rates, you can have the data. So you can see that something you're doing can and does have a very narrow database impact, but it is something measurable. And I think so for him, public health became a big area of focus, as did vaccines, because vaccines save lives. And if the problem is that corporations aren't going to make vaccines because there isn't enough money to be made and governments are too inefficient, or to distribute those vaccines, what can private money do? That's where he saw his point of entry, and within the field of public health. So it's still the dominant aspect of what the foundation does, but obviously now they have many more strategies.
Explain a little bit the ways in which the philanthropy of the Gates Foundation and this move into public health grew with respect to Gates into a much larger attitude about philanthropy. The work with Buffett, the Giving Pledge, etc. It seemed to come out of this in unique ways.
2006 really was a watershed moment for the world of philanthropy, for Gates's image, for Melinda French Gates, and for the Gates Foundation, because that's when Warren Buffett decided to make a lifetime pledge to give his all of his money to philanthropy. I mean, he had already decided that, but he decided then to give the bulk of his fortune to the Gates Foundation during his lifetime. And the lifetime piece is quite important because it has implications for what happened to the Gates Foundation now. But I think that that flood of money came in and transformed the Gates Foundation in the sense that suddenly you have to create a framework, build a foundation that can actually give that money away. So if you look at the period between 2006 and 2008 or 2009, the foundation grew from about 300 people to 1,500 people. They were in a frenzy of hiring, of finding new areas that they could give and direct money to, and there were no trade-offs essentially because there was so much money to give away. And I think it was I think Bill and Melinda felt a big responsibility to give that money away wisely. At the same time, I think this being an organization with so much money to give away ends up influencing global public health agendas, right? So it's just the fact of having $1 billion to give to public health, right? And then you have Bill Gates' star power. And so that kind of ends up really, really feeding on itself and creating the celebrity and creating these layers of influence that Gates has. And then you have the Giving Pledge. You mentioned that. And in 2010, I think that became an even bigger, um, you know, shine on Gates's image, if you will, because it was right after the financial crisis, and I think there was all of the Occupy Wall Street moment. There was a lot of anger at inequality, and the fact that a lot of wealthy people had led the economy into a recession. So if you came in at that moment and you had all these billionaires sign the pledge and commit to giving at least half their fortunes to philanthropy, that was and Gates being a driver of that, along with Buffett, I think really, really put him on a pedestal, unlike anyone else in the world, I would say.
How much was Gates aware of the scope of this philanthropy influencing public policy globally the way it did? It was more than just philanthropy, more than just expanding vaccines. As you said, it really became a policy setting vehicle as well. To what extent was Gates aware of that, and to what extent did he like that and want to continue to shape that?
Some of it, in according to my reporting and in my view, is organic. You go in, you are a celebrity, you are brilliant, you have ideas, and you have the money. So people listen. And once they listen, they begin to work together, and that brings the foundation more into the realm of development organizations. And then you can hire a lot of people with global expertise. You can hire the best minds at the foundation because you are able to offer them that environment. And so that expertise then gets more involved in priorities of the World Health Organization or other policymaking bodies. So I think some of it is organic, but also part of it is the fact that they have so much money. They're bigger than anyone else in the world in terms of a private philanthropy. And you have Gates' star power. And I think as a result of that, you get the rewards. And who wouldn't, even if you're a billionaire and one of the best known faces in the world, I think adulation and celebrity and stardom are always welcome. And I think people in general would enjoy that. And I don't see Gates as being any different, right? If you're going in and people are, falling at your feet eventually, I think that gives you a sense of the value you're contributing. And I think he said that himself, this idea that he created Microsoft and he turned to philanthropy, and the success of Microsoft, gave him the idea of like, okay, I've done this. What can I do next? If I did Microsoft the way I turned it into this massive company, wow, what can I do next? So it's a mix of things that feed into image, feed into Gates's influence. Some of it is a loop, And some of it is as he grows in influence, as people respond to him more, he gets, it's climate change now. He speaks a lot about climate change. It's a big priority for him. And I think people are definitely listening as they did when he talked about the likelihood of a pandemic in 2015. And he achieved oracular status when the pandemic did happen. And then he was everywhere talking about vaccines. And so I would say that it really just is endless and really interesting to observe.
How did he see the role of big philanthropy, things like the Gates Foundation? How did he see that relative to policy in governments in the U.S. and around the world?
I think he sees the role of philanthropy as catalytic, and he sees the role of philanthropy as filling the gaps between what corporations won't do because they don't have a profit motive and what governments won't do because they are inefficient and they don't have the delivery mechanisms to get even basic healthcare in a lot of countries. He saw that there is a more efficient approach and that he could not only partner with governments, as he has been very careful to do, as the foundation has been very careful to do in a country like India, where the government has quite a strong grip on setting priorities for non-governmental organizations. But in general, I feel that there was a vacuum almost, and a big philanthropic organization, it was there for the taking. Now, his intentions and the foundation's intentions are, of course, very noble. No one doubts that. But when you have a vacuum, you go into it, there might be no data. You create the metrics, you create the system. And this is a foundation that is very, very involved in measuring impact. And it's unlike a lot of other private organizations. So if they give you a money, if they give you a grant, they then have certain metrics for the nonprofit to live up to, and to gauge a program's success, it has to meet certain metrics. And so that is a level of involvement that you don't see elsewhere. And because in most countries, you don't have those resources, I think big philanthropy is quite welcome. And the data-driven approach is a direct extension of how Gates sees the world.
It is interesting when one looks at Microsoft when Gates was there and what he accomplished with it, the way he took the company public, the financial and business decisions he made, which set a template for a lot of what we've seen evolve over the years in Silicon Valley. And on the other hand, in the philanthropy area, that happened again, that what the Gates Foundation did, this focus on metrics, everything that you were just saying, that also has become a template with respect to philanthropy.
Absolutely. And I think that reflects the general bias of the tech world, that they're extremely metrics and data driven. And the idea, it's a combination actually of tech and finance, in the sense that you're looking at returns on investment. So if you take a philanthropic dollar and say that, okay, I'm going to put this where I think it'll make the most difference, it's basically the idea of a return on investment. Every dollar invested into a social good should give me the maximum bang for my buck. So I think there is that financial concept. And then you tie that in with, how do I measure that return on investment? You're using metrics, you're using data, you're setting these, creating these metrics and measures through which to gauge your own success. And it's something that has taken hold. And Gates, I think, had a lot of impact. The Gates Foundation, the way it did things, I think, had a lot of impact on people's thinking. And so that is very much fashionable in philanthropy right now. And I think that's the way it's going to keep going, compared to traditional philanthropy, where the notion was that you write a check to someone knowing that they are best prepared to do what they want to do with that money, to use it responsibly, because that's their area of expertise, right? So you write a check to a school or a hospital, and they endow a chair. And that was traditional the Gates Foundation's approach really shook up the world because it was new and it was not. And I think now, as I was saying, um, it's going to be, I think, the way people think about philanthropy into the future.
And how aware was Gates of the importance of his image and PR in continuing to shape what he wanted to do?
I think he is very receptive to the idea of image and to the necessity of it. And I think the result, the reason for that is that during the Microsoft trial, it you have to remember, and it was amazing because now we have so many tech giants, and they're all getting to antitrust scraps, and for alleged monopolistic behavior, but in the late 90s, you had Microsoft, and it was the country's biggest and most admired company, or one of. And then you had a trial that riveted the nation. And so Gates's behavior, especially when he was on trial and he testified, was very much there for everyone to see. And I think he sometimes was petulant. At one point, he debated the meaning of the word if in court. And he gave interviews that didn't really help his cause, didn't really help promote the personality was not value add at that time. So when he turned to philanthropy, and he was always savvy about public relations from the point of view of getting buzz for Microsoft products. He understood how, and this is what people who worked with him told me, that he was very focused on looking at how a product that Microsoft had built, how it was reviewed by the tech press, and how it was being pitched. And he was very involved with that, but it was kind of a product driven PR and less of an image driven PR. And I think the image driven PR was partly necessary because of Microsoft. And you began to hire more people, and during the, when the foundation, once the Buffett money started coming in, I think there were a lot of reporters asking what this foundation was going to do with all that money. And so they realized that they needed to build communications team and create a big team that could message what communicate to the world what the foundation was going to do. And I think the idea at that point was that Gates and French Gates, Melinda French Gates, were going to be the spokespeople for the foundation, because that's what people want, that's whom people wanted to hear from. So that idea then meant that you're putting someone out there speaking on behalf of the foundation. So what is that image you want to create of that person that will make it most impactful? And so you take some of Gates's qualities, take some of the things he represents, and you burnish that, you put that out in the world, and you see that it's successful. And I think once you had social media, it allowed Gates a way to build an enormous fan base, global fan base, because he had this. He started a blog called Gates Notes in 2010. And I think that has given him a direct platform to talk about what he's seeing, what he's hearing, to post these goofy videos of him doing stuff with Warren Buffett, designed to quote unquote humanize him, as I was told repeatedly by people who were involved in some of this polishing. And so he has been more receptive to the idea and importance of image, and partly because, from what I understand, because he was so scarred by Microsoft, by the Microsoft experience, and also because he needs to be an advocate for the work that the foundation's doing. So whether or not he likes it personally, I think he understands the importance of sustaining a certain image to be able to get that kind of attention, to basically lean into his celebrity to advocate for the foundation's work.
And talk about how he sees billionaires today. At the time that Gates became a billionaire, at the time that he started the Gates Foundation, there were a limited number of billionaires in the country and a limited spotlight on them. Today, there are not quite 1,000, but almost 1,000 billionaires, and certainly they get endless attention. How does Gates see that relative to himself?
Gates has spoken largely about wealth in terms of urging people to think and give more to philanthropic causes. And I think he's appealed to billionaires directly through the Giving Pledge. He has also spoken in support of higher taxes. And however, he is apolitical. And I think that is important because when you wade into billionaire territory, it is very contentious. The idea of, are they good? Are they bad? What does it mean in the context of widening inequality? What does it mean in terms of, who's supporting whom, who's funding whose political campaign? And I think all of that would be harmful for Gates to really be involved in. So he has been quite apolitical from the way I see it, but he has in general spoken about the need for billionaires to part with more of their money. Even as he does understand that there's some criticism about his use of a private jet, given the carbon footprint is so high, and he apologizes for that in jest, but he's very aware of that, that he might not be practicing everything that he's preached. But I think he's generally aware. I don't think he's leaned into the issue of billionaires, but I think he has definitely spoken about aspects of what they do, about inequality, about what is possible if you have that kind of money.
And finally, we're almost out of time. Does he have a sense of the way his image has suffered today? How does he imagine, do you think, reinventing himself in this current climate?
Post Epstein, I do think that it was quite a shock to the world, to the Gates team, to Gates himself. And he does get extremely frustrated if you watch him when he's being asked about Epstein and what that was all about. I think he has provided a statement. He has always been very clear that it was a lapse in judgment, and he should have known better than to lend credibility to Epstein. And I think his team has gone into overdrive in terms of sustaining and burnishing his image. They're quite aggressive when it comes to dealing with any Epstein-related matters that Gates is portrayed in. And so I see that they're quite defensive, they're quite aggressive at the same time. So they understand that the association with Epstein was very damaging to Gates's image.
And does he understand why?
I mean, I wish I knew what was in the mind of Bill Gates. I would give anything for that. I have to believe that he does, even if he didn't at the beginning, because here's a man who again understands has a very rational approach to the world. So if he thinks that he can get something for a cause that he believes in, which is philanthropy, and if Epstein's promising him something that he thinks he could get, he's going to go meet him, and he's not thinking about the optics of that. And beyond that, I don't think, at least I was not able to find what happened, if there's anything that happened beyond meeting for philanthropic causes. And that's what Gates has always maintained, and that's what's in the documents that were released as part of cases against Epstein. And so you see this image of someone trying to befriend Bill Gates, and Bill Gates being responsive to some of that, perhaps not realizing the optics of that until much later when the news started coming out, and then apologizing and being very clear that there was nothing more to his relationship with Epstein.
That's hard to imagine in light of some of these other stories, in fact, that have come out most recently, even in the New York Times, about Gates's time at Microsoft and what went on there with respect to Me Too-like situations.
Interestingly, I remember reading, I believe it was a 1994 Playboy article, or maybe it was a Fortune article, which had an interesting aside. So you're describing Gates as the sort of abrasive CEO of Microsoft, co-founder, all of that, his talents and skills, and the fact that he loves fast cars. And then it says, oddly, he's also something of a ladies' man, which struck me as interesting and almost out of place, because that's you stop and go, huh, really? I didn't think of Gates as that way. And there's no reason for me to think of Gates as one way or another. But the fact that it was there signaled that maybe there was, there's an aspect of his personality that we don't think about. And also in the 90s, this was before a lot of HR policies existed I mean, they might have existed on paper, but it's definitely not what it's like today. And I think the culture of any company, including Microsoft, would be that, especially at tech conferences. I mean, things like Comdex. I mean, it's well known that you had escorts come in and kind of entertain the guests, and maybe escorts is too strong of a word, but you did have um, an environment that you wouldn't have today. So Gates was steeped in that environment, and he has had, as has been well reported, extramarital affairs. So if you put all of that together, there is an aspect to the man that I think also creates more nuance and complexity. And I think you might argue that because these are private, we're all complicated, and this is a private matter, and why should we think about it? But at the same time, when you are a public figure, when what you do should be held to account, I think those become questions worth examining and worth reporting. And then you begin looking at the patterns, going back to Microsoft, going back to the culture, going back to what was generally widely known inside the company. And I think when there is buzz and when there is a general sense of a person's behavior, it is quite grounded in the person's behavior as is observed by people around him. And so to me, that speaks of a greater truth than, oh, this is a case in which Gates did X and Gates did Y. And it was interesting to find that on the inside and kind of like compare it to the man on the outside.
And I guess the other part of it, the final part of it, is that it because it is all coming out and being revealed now and being talked about now post the divorce, that he's seen in the same context as how we see so many other billionaires. And it puts an even brighter light on it and a more negative light.
It does, especially because he did seem unimpeachable for a long
Mm-hmm.
time. And because of what, um, as someone I spoke to, I mentioned in the book, said it's like God had fallen to earth. And I think it did far more for someone like Gates. All of this news coming out, I think it was a shock to people because they hadn't thought about him in that context at all. Unless you look at the 80s and 90s when he was at Microsoft, when there were all of these sort of um, articles, and there's a book called Hard Drive, which has this anecdote about Gates lying on top of a woman at 5 a.m. This was, I believe, before his marriage. So there were these aspects that would trickle out in the 80s. And then you kind of had this like massive shift to seeing Gates in one way, i.e., the good billionaire, the moral billionaire, the savior of the world, if you will, this selfless philanthropist. And then suddenly you have this rupture, which is my point of entry, definitely, into the story.
Anupreeta Das, her book is Billionaire Nerd Savior King, Bill Gates and His Quest to Shape Our World. I thank you so very much for being with us today.
Thank you, Jeff. This was a lot of fun.
Thank you.